Welcome, everyone. I am Harmony Barker, Public Programs Manager at Holocaust Museum LA, the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States founded by survivors. We were founded in 1961 by survivors who wanted to create a safe place to display their precious artifacts, to remember their family members and loved ones who had perished, and to educate future generations on the important lessons of the Holocaust. Today, the museum continues to provide free Holocaust education to students from across Los Angeles, the United States, and the world, fulfilling the mission of our founders to commemorate, educate, and inspire. Thank you for joining us for today's talk with author Jonathan Ned Katz about his new book, The Daring Life and Dangerous Times of Eve Adams. Eve Adams was a rebel. Born into a Jewish family in Poland, she immigrated to the United States in 1912, where she befriended anarchists, sold radical publications, and ran lesbian and gay-friendly speakeasies in Chicago and New York. Adams' left activism and links to notorious anarchists caught the attention of a young J. Edgar Hoover and the US Bureau of Investigation, leading to her surveillance, arrest, and deportation back to Europe, where she was ultimately murdered by Nazis in Auschwitz. Jonathan Ned Katz is an independent scholar, historian, public intellectual, and activist who focuses on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and heterosexual US history. He has written extensively on the history of sexuality in books such as Gay American History, Lesbians and Gay Men in the USA, and The Invention of Heterosexuality. In 2008, Jonathan's long history as a community-based scholar and history activist led him to found outhistory.org, a place of active community participation in the process of discovering and writing LGBTQ histories. He is also a visual artist whose work has been exhibited at the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York. We are so pleased to have Jonathan here with us today to share Eve's story. Before we get started, please note that you will have some time at the end of the program to ask questions. You will be able to ask a question by typing it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Ned Katz.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be talking about Eve here in particular. Let's show some pictures first so that the audience gets a sense of the people involved in who I will be talking about and will be talking about. So you have the pictures of Eve, yes. So that's the, just the first picture. That's her in the middle. And it's my favorite picture of her. It's from 1941, and she was hoping to come back to the United States after being deported. Next slide. Eve, look at the contrast in the way she's dressed. She's visiting her family in 1925. She went back to Poland after coming to the United States. Note the way her sister is dressed on the right. Eve is in the middle in a pantsuit, very advanced for 1925. And she seems to be wearing white Oxfords. And her, and her brother, Yera Camille, is on the left. Next. Eve, that's the whole version of Eve's passport photo from 1941. In it, she's dressed very casually, and she looks like somebody right now. She looks like one of my pals, and I love this picture. I'm so glad we have it. Next. That's Ben Reitman, Eve's friend who she wrote letters to. He was an anarchist at the time Eve met him, and sort of a rebel, another rebel type doctor who was Emma Goldman's boyfriend for a time. And he plays a big role in Eve's life. Next slide. Alexander Berkman on the right and Emma Goldman talking on the left in Union Square in New York City. It's a great image of her reaching out to, talking to a large audience, I guess, in a loud voice she must have had. No artificial, speakers and microphones in those days. Yes, these famous, notorious anarchists were really important in Eve's life. Next. Oh, that's an ad that Eve must have put in the newspaper when she was selling radical periodicals. You will know her by her hair. She might have dyed it for a while, so you would show up and help her make sales and people remember her. So I love this ad as well. She must have put it in herself, nobody else. It's exactly the hairdo that she had in her 1925 photo, exactly. Next. Oh, that's an actress, Fanya Maranov, who Eve writes a very excited, adoring fan letter to, and I will describe that later in a talk in my overview of Eve's life. Next. Oh, a scary card. It's the Justice Department or Bureau of Investigation file card on Adams Eva, alias Eva Zlotchever, radical activities. And those radical activities were selling radical periodicals. Forget about freedom of the press, forget about freedom of speech. They did not, the investigation of Eve did not care about either of those values. Next slide. The Gray Cottage was one of the tea rooms, they were called, that Eve helped to found, that she founded. And this one was in Chicago. It's advertised as Chicago's Greenwich Village Tea Room. So the Village in New York was sort of the site of, bohemian life. They were, yes. And I love that it says Eve Adams and Ruth Norlander in charge. It gave maybe a clue to same-sex couples that they'd be welcome. And it was certainly a bohemian hangout for everybody, artists and intellectuals. It became famous. I'll talk about it later. Next slide. Oh, Eve's, she signed this intention to become a citizen, but she never did. And it's too bad because she would have been much more protected with civil rights if she had not remained an alien, as they called her in many documents. Alien, that term is really telling to me. Next slide. Oh, that's 129 McDougal around 1940. And it's a restaurant now, and it looks completely different. And it's been changed, but that's where Eve's Cafe in New York was. It was called Eve's Hangout, and it was in the basement. You can just see the basement window, and there's a steps down there. And it's such an atmospheric black and white picture. And it's wonderful to have that because Eve's Cafe in New York, Eve's Hangout, became quite famous. I'll talk about that. Next. Oh, Eve's Fingerprints. Another very generous researcher found these by accident in the New York Municipal Archives. She was going through for research purposes and knew about Eve and picked up on this. They're haunting to me. They bring us close, I think, to Eve's bodily presence, and therefore it's in a way that maybe some of the other things don't. Next. Oh, well, Eve was sent to jail, and we'll talk about how that happened. And in jail, she met Mae West, of all people. Mae had been sent there for producing a play on Broadway called Sex, and it was called Obscene. So she was put in jail under the same law that Eve was convicted, obscenity law. But Mae West was only given 10 days and served 8, and Eve was given a year and served, for 2 crimes, she served a year and a half. So there was this huge difference in the two meeting, Mae West meeting Eve Adams. It's just like 2 very different people, but they were both pioneers in talking about sex in public. And that was really daring. So next slide. Those are the 4 illustrations from Eve's book, Lesbian Love, that she published in 1925. And it gives you a sense of sort of how, erotic they were. And I have been told that there were pictures that like these that appeared in books that didn't get challenged as obscene. So they're called obscene later. They're used against Eve, but there's nothing really going on in them, and the pictures like these were around in regular books. I was told, yes. Next, Eve's passport from 1929. It was so wonderful when we discovered that late in my research, and look at her signature. It's so wonderful to have that bold signature of hers. It just puts us in touch with her a little more. And she still has that sort of part in the middle haircut, and she's wearing sort of a tie and sort of a mannish kind of clothes, considered mannish in that time. Next. It's a Polish passport. A wonderful, affectionate caricature of Eve that appeared in a French newspaper, and I'll talk about that later. So I love this picture. I find it really charming, and there's a wonderful talk in the column about Eve, which I will describe. Next. Hella Olstein, who was a singer and became Eve's longtime companion and live with companion for about 13 years in France after Eve was deported to France. Hella was a singer in French cafes. So that let's see the next slide. We'll see Hella singing. Oh no, that's Eve. Eve in 1934, in Paris with a beret. I love it. She has a beret. She's looking really French there. And she looks pretty tough there. That's the tough Eve. Next slide. Oh, in the middle of that postcard, which Eve signed and Hella signed, and it's sent to Hella's family in Switzerland, you can see a Nazi swastika under the eagle. And it's just a sign of the Nazis taking over in France in 1940. And these 2 women, these 2 Jewish women's increasing threat and increasing fear of being rounded up. Next. That is Hella performing. It's very hard to see here, but she's performing in a certain kind of song that involved her, and she's in the middle. She's playing a major role. So she was pretty prominent because there's like 18 chorus girls behind her in at least one of them, I counted. And so it gives you it gives you a sense of one kind of production that Hella was involved in. She brought in the bacon, so to speak. She brought in that helped keep them, Eve and her, going for when times got bad. Next. Eve and Hella, Eve on the right, Hella on the left. I don't know when it or where it was taken, but also we discovered this late in the research, but I was able to get a version of it into my biography of Eve. It was wonderful. So next. Oh, the last slide. It's a list of people on Convoy 63. The Nazis were very efficient list makers. It lists Eve name down near the end. And it's scary, you know, of course. And I just thought it was important to include in this. It's part of Eve's history, but it's not the only part of her history. So that's my talk with the pictures. Now I'd just like to give you an overview of Eve's life. On November 30th, 1926, at Eve's deportation hearing at the Women's Penitentiary on Welfare Island, now it's called Roosevelt Island, Eve responded to the charge that she had published an indecent book. I admit having written a book entitled Lesbian Love, based on true acts and living characters of today. The object of the book was to show the exact things that are happening from day to day. And every character is a true character, and except she is given an assumed name. I believe the book is not in any way vulgar, indecent, or immoral. There is not one word in the whole book that is vulgar. I can't see why I should be singled out and sentenced to imprisonment for writing my book, which was only meant to show the humorous side of life, the serious side of life, and tragedy all in one. Born Krawaz Lotchewer in 1891 into a Jewish family in Poland, Adams emigrated to the United States in 1912. In the US, the 21-year-old Eve befriended anarchists, the famous anarchists, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, and got to know the larger-than-life Ben Lewis Reitman. In New York City, Eve worked in the garment industry, which was big in New York City at the time, in a sweatshop factory, and was a member of the Progressive Ladies Waist Makers Union, makers of women's blouses. One of the lesbians profiled in Eve's book, Little Jimmy, may actually be Eve. Little Jimmy works in a ladies' waist shop and goes on vacation to a hotel started by her union. I figured out that this resort was Unity House in Bushkill, Pennsylvania, initiated by radical Jewish women garment workers. These women argued with their doubting male comrades that working class solidarity would be enhanced if union members had a country place to dance. Little Jimmy dances with a woman at the resort, and this leads to a romantic sexual encounter that is described in Eve's book. In Eve's book, she talks a lot about gender issues. Eve's narrator says, little did Jimmy know of herself. Little she knew of the masculine spark within her. All she knew was that she felt more comfortable in boyish clothes. She could run better, climb trees better, and feel unhampered in every action. That masculine spark, that male-typed yearning to run, climb, pursue boys' activities, wear boys' clothes, and feel free, is a repeated poignant theme in several early narratives of persons born female who rejected restrictive feminine norms. Although Jimmy is the only girl at the hotel enjoying this, which Eve calls this boyish freedom, no one frowns on Jimmy's clothes or demeanor, so she is perfectly at ease, in quotes. Elsewhere, it seems Jimmy's clothes and swagger have elicited criticism. And I think that it's documented that Eve's demeanor and clothes certainly did get negative comment, as you will see. After several years, Eve got tired of factory work, and by 1918, she had probably begun to sell radical periodicals, including the Yiddish humor magazine Der große Kundes, literally the big stick, more expressively the big prankster. Eve had dinner one night with Jacob Marinoff, editor of The Big Prankster, and Jacob's sister, the actress, Vanya Marinoff, was also at the dinner along with her husband, Carl Van Vechten. And Carl was mostly homosexual, but this marriage lasted 50 years with ups and downs. There's a book about them. Vanya was then starring in a Greenwich Village theater in a play advocating free love. Eve was clearly enchanted by the actress and wrote her a fervid fan letter. Quote, "I saw nothing else but your beautiful dark eyes, which are hidden under those long, long eyelashes. Yet I saw your soul, and it made me shiver and respect you so much more than an ordinary actor. You were not an actress, Miss Marinoff. You were a great artist and may be compared to the world's greatest." Eve was still learning English at the time. I find that charming that her book represents. It was not edited by a helpful editor. It's Eve speaking. Eve started making a living as a touring saleswoman of radical periodicals. And because of her association with left radical causes and famous anarchists, Eve started to be surveilled by the Bureau of Investigation. That was the forerunner of the FBI. The young Justice Department employee, John Edgar Hoover, he was just starting out on his wonderful career, initiated much of this surveillance of Eve because of what the Bureau called her radical activities, her selling radical periodicals. Anti-Jewish and anti-gender bending comments are blatant in the reports of Bureau of Investigation agents. A Los Angeles agent commented on Eve's appearance, quote, "Jewish type, hair cropped, complexion, skin," that's her skin color, medium, so she wasn't quite white enough for him, "not attractive, wears nose glasses." How about that? A citizen informer, Dr. Charles T. Bayless, walked into the San Francisco Bureau office to inform on Eve. Bayless described Eve to the Justice Department, quote, "She has short, fuzzy red hair, dresses mannishly, and is dirty, greasy, and Jewish in appearance." Bayless was touring the US in 1919, presenting a speech titled "Making a Better America," In one talk, Bayliss advocated, deport the alien red, put the native-born traitor in jail, restrict immigration to desirable persons, and teach Americanism in the public schools. Around 1921, 1922, Eve settled in Chicago, and with a beloved woman partner, Ruth Norlander, an artist, they opened a queer-friendly bohemian cafe, the Gray Cottage. They advertised it as Chicago's Greenwich Village Tea Room, Eve Adams and Ruth Norlander in charge. Poet Kenneth Rexroth recalled the cottage as much the most bohemian of the bohemian tea rooms of Chicago's North Side. One unhappy visitor to the cottage called it that refuge of thwarted intellect, whose artistic atmosphere included one soiled menu card and one frowsy-haired proprietress who borrows cigarettes. That was probably Eve because she smoked. Numerous Chicago newspaper ads for the Gray Cottage refer to Eve's friend, Ben Reitman, as chairman of weekly talks. So here's this straight guy, chairman, prevailing over this weekly talks. One talk was on vice and virtue in the village, a talk advertised with saying Reitman would lead it with hot discussion. Gee, I wish I could have been there for that talk. Another talk was on sensuality in American fiction. Oh, I wanted to be for that one too. In 1925, Eve had split with Norlander and came back to New York City. There in Greenwich Village, in the basement of 129 McDougal Street, it's near Washington Square Park, she opened another queer and bohemian-friendly cafe, Eve's Hangout. After Eve had gotten in trouble, the entertainment industry trade paper Variety reported, quote, shortly before launching her tea room, Eve had affected masculine attire and become a regular at the various resorts catering to temperamentals. That's a term from the time for homosexuals. When Eve opened her tea room on McDougal Street, the paper alleged she'd given, quote, the tip-off of what kind of a joint it was through placarding the main entrance with a sign which read, men are admitted but not welcome. That sign, I think, probably never existed. It's not mentioned in any other source, and its words suspiciously promote the stereotype of lesbians as man-haters, which is documented in other parts of the book. It was a common idea about lesbians at the time. In 1925, Adams risked all to write and publish a book titled Lesbian Love. It briefly pictures about 24 women. It's not a book of short stories as it's been described on the web. It really amounts to a pioneering lesbian community study, and there's a whole series of community studies done by community members that were pioneering in themselves. And this is sort of the first, I think, of that group, of that genre. One of the best sections, I think, of Eve's book is titled, How I Found Myself. In this, an unnamed narrator describes her first sexual experience with a woman at age 19. The first person narrator suggests that 2 years before Eve immigrated to the United States, she had experienced a sensual encounter that her narrator recalls as, quote, beautiful and one of the most significant events of my life. Eve's surveillance by Bureau of Investigation agents and immigration officials led to Eve's arrest. Immigration officials, the New York City police, and a biased informer, and a number of state employees were all out to get her because basically of her politics, and then he used the lesbian stuff. I have documented an actual conspiracy between a judge, parole officials, and immigration officials to deport Eve, to make sure she got deported. Eve was convicted of publishing an obscene book. She was also convicted of a second charge, attempted sex with a policewoman who had been sent in to entrap her. Adams was jailed for a year and a half and then deported. Eve lived and worked in France for 13 years, selling what were considered dirty books at the time. These were books in English that US and British tourists could not buy in their own country, so they went to Paris to buy them, snuck them home. Along with Fanny Hill, Eve sold books by James Joyce, Aeneas Nin, D.H. Lawrence, and Henry Miller, with whom Eve became good friends. And these books have all become modernist classics, and a lot of them are now read in freshman college English classes. So much for time. Time is important when context is important, historical context. Eve was written up while she was in Paris. Eve was written up in the New York Tribune, which is a newspaper published in Paris in English, in a column by an American journalist with the unusual name of Wombley Bald. Bald called Eve one of the few females who never criticizes other women. Bald then added, Eve had, quote, been asked to leave America because she wrote a harmless little book called Lesbian Love. He concluded with an amazing prophecy. One of these years, America won't act that way. I'm bowled over by that brief, bold comment. Those extraordinary words are the single defense of Eve's book published in her lifetime. Bald's brave words accompanied the affectionate caricature of Eve that I showed you earlier. Eve and her dear, close live-with companion, Hella Olstein, were living in France, in Paris, when the Nazis invaded Paris in 1940. They managed to evade trouble for 3 years, but were finally arrested and sent to Auschwitz and murdered. In my research on Eve, I was fortunate that Eve's brother, Yerakmiel, who immigrated to Israel, had a son, and that son had a son, Eran Zahavi. And very late in my research, Erin tried to find the family of Eve's companion, Hella Olstein. And sure enough, Eran found a lawyer in Switzerland, Daniel Olstein, whose father was Hella's brother. And sure enough, Daniel Olstein turned out to have an amazing, important collection of letters letters from Hella and Eve. They wrote notes on the same letter, including one, the new passport photo of Eve that I showed you, the 1929 one, and 2 photos of Eve and Hella together. And having Hella's and Eve's letters to family members allowed me to communicate the tightening grip of the Nazis in France and the 2 women's desperate hope to escape. And after evading the Nazis for 3 years, both Hella and Eve were arrested. They were carried from France to Auschwitz in Poland on Nazi Convoy 63, and that's that list from Convoy 63 that I showed you. There's like about 850 people named on it. A trip of about 3 days in a cattle car. It was torture. Amazingly, 3 survivors of Convoy 63 and Auschwitz wrote memoirs detailing the horror of that Convoy 63 trip, the very trip Eve and Hella were on. Those descriptions allowed me to convey the horror of Auschwitz itself, which doesn't seem to be very well documented. The Nazis destroyed a lot of documents when they left Auschwitz and when the Allies were approaching. So Eve Adams' life, to summarize, Eve Adams' life links diverse pasts, making her life directly relevant, I think, to present concerns. One, her publishing Lesbian Love makes her central to the history of sexuality and especially to lesbian resistance history. 2, repeated critical references to Eve's gender bending make her story central to the history of changing norms of masculinity and femininity. 3, Eve's story is central to the history of immigration, in particular Jewish immigration to the US from Eastern Europe in the early 20th century. And Eve's migrations from Poland to the US to France and her visits to Berlin, London, Stockholm make her an international heroine. 4, Eve's life is embedded in modern Jewish history, and her mode of death situates her in the history of anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, and genocide in general. 5, Eve's life represents a too rare example of working class history and working class and left organizing for a fairer world, along with union organizing. 6, Eve's surveillance by Bureau of Investigation agents and the repressive collusion of federal, state, and city officials, a judge, and local police officers make Eve's story relevant to the history of population tracking and repressive government responses to social justice movements. We've seen that recently, unfortunately. And lastly, the rise of fascism really make, in Eve's time, has eerie resemblances to our own time. At the end of my biography of Eve, I indicate that her story can serve as an early warning signal, I think. I say, on the last page of the biography, I imagine seeing Eve way, way off in the distance and waving her arms frantically, trying to get our attention. And I hear her shouting something, but I can't quite hear. And then I do hear Eve shouting, "Don't mourn, organize." And that's my talk for tonight. And I really look forward to audience responses and comments from our wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that talk. What an incredibly powerful image to end on. The idea that she's trying to warn us from the past and encourage us to mobilize and continue to fight against all of these challenges that she faced in her own life: anti-immigration sentiment, anti-Semitism, homophobia. It's incredibly, incredibly powerful. Thank you so much for that. To your point of bringing Eve into the present day, that she's so relevant to the present moment, I do also want to point out for our viewers that Eve was actually arrested by the NYPD Vice Squad, which was the notorious unit that raided the Stonewall Inn in New York leading to the Stonewall riots several decades later, which is and that was in June of 1969, and that's why we honor and commemorate Pride Month in June. Yeah. So I'll just ask a few questions while our viewers can sort of start to get their questions in order. Viewers, you can type your questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. In the meantime, I have a few questions of my own for Jonathan. First of all, how did you first learn about Eve, and what drew you to her story as a historian?
Well, I was reading the New York Times book review in December 2016, and I came across a reference it was in a book about New York City women who had done important, influential things or of different types. And it mentioned a Polish Jewish woman who'd gotten in trouble, was coming onto a policewoman and got deported. I said, who is this? I never heard of it. I didn't remember ever reading about Eve before, although some stuff was around already. So I started to do, she sounded so interesting that I started to do research, because as a historian, I always try to see what is available already rather than reinventing the wheel and redoing research that people have already done. So I started investigating. I found Barbara Kahn, who was a playwright who had done 3 different versions of plays based on Eve's life, and they were well researched. She also had the help, she did some research herself, and she also had the help of a gay male archivist and librarian who was very good and you know, a professional at such finding things in archives. So so Barbara's plays got attention. So on the internet, a woman wrote to Barbara that she had found a copy of Eve's book, Lesbian Love, in the lobby of her building in Albany, New York, 25 years ago. And it, you know, this may be the one copy in the world now. And I was very lucky to have that this woman was willing to send me a copy. And we've reprinted the Eve's whole book exactly as she printed it, with the typos and everything, because it shows Eve's voice, even though it has typos and, you know, incorrect English, and nobody, it's really great that no editor sort of took over and changed anything, because we really know it's Eve speaking in her book. So that's a bit of the first research process, how I got involved.
Thank you. And as you've already pointed out, Eve was sort of lived at this intersection of different marginalized groups at the time. Growing up in Poland, what was her life like as a young woman before she immigrated, as a young Jewish woman and a young, you know, woman discovering her sexuality and realizing shortly before she left that she was lesbian?
Yeah, well, I write about this in the book, and I had to learn about it myself. I think we have a stereotype in our minds based on Fiddler on the Roof of the shtetls as very backward places. But it turns out that historians have shown that Poland was seething with political, you know, there were the Zionists that wanted to stay in Poland and reform the country there. Some wanted to go to Palestine. There were nationalists, there were, you know, liberals, there were all kinds of political struggles going on, even a feminist movement that unfortunately turned anti-Semitic, but it wasn't to start with, apparently. So began to inspire some women. So I got a completely different sense of this, what was going on. There was a revolt against the Tsar because Russia controlled Poland, and this was in 1905. So it was a sign of rebellion in the making. It didn't go very far. The Tsar clamped down, but there was a liberalization that began to happen then. So there was a lot going on. So we don't know exactly, Eve meets this woman that she has this first affair with, or first sexual experience with, at some kind of artist colony. So an artist colony in Poland, it's not how we think of, we have such a stereotype, I think, of other places. It was the late 19th century, Eve was born in 1891. So she was, a young woman at the turn of the century. And the world was changing at the turn of the century, not just the United States, other places as well.
That's it's very interesting to learn that there seemed to be such a thriving, changing environment, because I do think there is that a little bit of that fiddler on the roof mindset that a lot of people hold of what Eastern Europe, especially Jewish Eastern Europe, looked like before, World War I, say.
Yes, my sense now is that there was huge ferment in all kinds of areas, artistic and political and cultural and feminist and all kinds of things.
Yeah. All right, I think I'll ask just one last question before we turn it over to our audience. After bringing Eve's history to light in this book, are there still any missing pieces for you? Anything, any spots where you don't quite know what she was up to or where she was that you still hope to answer someday?
Well, I'm hoping that the publication of the book will lead to the discovery of a few more precious documents about her life. For instance, she writes to her friend Ben Reitman that she has written a description of her jail experience in New York, and that has disappeared. I was not able to find it any place. It was during her Paris time, and who knows in the available archives, it's not listed. So that's one document I hope will be found. I think more will be found. Already, the New York, it's called the New York City LGBT Sites Project, found pictures of the apartment building that Eve lived in, which I had not been able to find. The whole research process has been one of a cooperative endeavor. And I think I want to stress that. It's really, I got wonderfully generous help from a whole variety of people. And it's really important to say that and stress that. And I think it'll continue in the future. Already there are some additional Bureau of Investigation files that have been found that under some obscure name that I hadn't found, and they help to convey Eve's voice, the documents that convey Eve's voice are especially important. So I was thrilled by that. And I've published a lot of the documents on outhistory.org. So people, after reading the book, I would suggest reading the book first, can then go and look at particular documents, see the original documents that I've used to tell her story. And there's probably a lot of other things that could be discovered too. Maybe like, comments. I bet there's a comment in Der Große Kundes magazine, it's in Yiddish, about Eve's arrest or deportation or both, because the editor was her friend and the publication was being published at the time. So I urge anyone who wants to take on the research project of looking in the archives of that journal, which exists both in the United States and in Canada, I believe. It's people who know Yiddish, I hope, will try to find some reference, even indirect, to the arrest of somebody, for a supposed obscenity. I would expect it to be really defiant and bitter and maybe humorous attack on Puritanism or something like that. Who knows? It would be fascinating it's a logical thing that this Jacob Maranoff would have written and gotten something into his periodical reacting to Eve Adams' arrest.
Well, it sounds like our viewers, you all have your homework assignments. I have put outhistory.org's website as well as the NYC LGBT historic sites website in the chat. And now I'll open it up to questions from our audience. Maybe you have a future research assistant among them, Jonathan.
Ooh, that would be great.
All right, so we have a question here from Janet. Did Eve's friend Reitman have any descendants that might have had letters or photos of their time, their friendship?
Yes, Reitman did have descendants. He had a family. His son was killed in an aviation plane crash. But there were a daughter or two, there were two daughters actually, I believe. So it's possible there could be something. I don't know much about that family archive. That could be investigated. All right, there's something else that could be more investigated. And if people are interested in researching this, I encourage them to. They can contact me through outhistory.org and let me know, and I can help them, point them to how to research and what needs to be researched. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll wait for a few more questions to come in.
I'll say more. Just Reitman left a huge archive in Chicago himself, including 5 or 7 letters or correspondences with Eve, even one letter that he wrote her. And I suspect that there's a bit more stuff in this disorganized, badly cataloged, huge Ben Reitman archive in Chicago. So I might even be a couple of pictures of Eve that have gotten in there somehow. Yeah, that's another source that needs to be further investigated. I did my best, but it could be more researched.
Mm-hmm. All right, looks like while we're waiting for some people to finish typing their questions, I have another one for you. Were there other LGBTQ stories from the time of the Holocaust that you encountered in your research? Or do you have any recommended reading for our viewers who might be interested in similar topics?
Yes, well, you can Google LGBT and Holocaust, and you will get a list. You can, on the site, especially, I think it's on the U.S. Holocaust Museum site, or both on the Mémorial de la Shoah in Paris, a list of literature on the subject. These Holocaust museums are now talking about LGBT history, and historians are working on, there's some very interesting scholarly articles on the subject of lesbian experiences under the Nazis in Germany, even though they weren't considered illegal under German law as gay males were, still historians are beginning to find that it's more complicated, that a lot of lesbians did get in trouble in Germany. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this. The research on it is fairly recent, but there is a lot and very interesting research. Some of it's in the notes to my biography of Eve, and you will find more, as I said, on the Holocaust sites. There's bibliographies of important works on the subject.
Yeah, the U.S. United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is an incredible resource, and it is an interesting difference in the way that lesbian women versus gay men were treated under the Nazi regime. Lesbian women were still women in the eyes of the Nazis, which means they could still bear children and they could still further the Aryan race, which, and there was sort of a mentality that maybe they could be changed or forced to bear children, which, is evil in its own way. But there was a legal distinction in the way that Nazi law treated lesbian women versus gay men. But I'm sure I look forward to seeing some of the new research that is being done, because I'm sure that there is more to be discovered.
Yes, there is. It's already discovered in some cases.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any new questions. So I'm going to just ask one more about your research process, see if we can get anyone involved in hitting the pavement and doing some research for you. Was there anything surprising that you encountered in your research? Anything that you didn't expect to find, or that you couldn't believe it was where it was, or that just contained information that you never would have thought that you would find?
Yeah, well, there was major document had been discovered by Berkman and Steve Siegel, who was her helper, research assistant. And so I was ahead with the research in many ways by that. I studied carefully, was surprised to find all the letters of Eve and Ben Reitman in the Chicago library. They may have found those too, I forget. The new, really new stuff was about Hella Olstein. Starting out, we didn't know the name of the woman that Hella writes, that Eve writes to Ben Reitman that she's met this woman, but I think she doesn't name her, or certainly doesn't give her last name. So we weren't able ever to figure out who this woman was. So a very a wonderful woman researcher who worked on a website. I'm forgetting her name at the moment, but she was a wonderful researcher. She was able to do the research that she did research on the address in Nice that Hella and Eve were living in. And that led to that I think is what led to the finding of Hella's last name. So then Aaron, I was done with the research. I would have published the book then. But Iran, as I said, in Eve's Eve was his great aunt, I think was how you describe it. as I said earlier, just took it on his own to reach out to this family, to find this family in Switzerland that ended up having a file of Eve's and letter and Hella's photos and letters from them, whole letters and cards and with a Nazi stamp on it. That's where that comes from. So that was a complete, when Iran told me in a Zoom call that he had found Hella's family and they had a file in their closet, I said, what? I couldn't believe it. It was such great news. And what am I gonna hear about? It got better and better as the family showed me the file. And I must say, my experience of families' enthusiastic help with the research was wonderful. In the old days, families would have been so ashamed of their lesbian pioneer that they would have burned the letters or destroyed the file. But we're finding a whole different world out there today. And Iran's part of the family and Daniel Olstein in Switzerland was completely helpful and positive and wonderful about helping with the research and letting me reproduce the photos and their collections, and wonderful. And we actually had a party for Eve Adams at 129 McDougal where Eve's hangout was last week. And Aaron came from Israel to celebrate the publication of the biography. So that was thrilling. And he's a lovely man. And it's just it was very moving to me.
That seems like a wonderful way to honor her legacy, and thank goodness for progress that these families had kept these records and were so willing to share their ancestors' stories with you.
Yes, I think Holocaust families are very more likely to save documentation of their relatives who disappeared, much more likely, of course, than perhaps other families who don't have the same background. So that I was lucky, though. We're lucky that the Olstein family, passed this file along the years, from it was Hella's brothers whom she visited, and her father, and Eve joined in and knew the family and was friendly. They were both friendly with the family. And it was wonderful to discover that. That was a big discovery, I guess.
Well, we have one last question from our audience, and then we'll close out. But someone from our audience wants to know, what's the next book project? What can we expect from you next?
Oh, a memoir, maybe. Writing books is really hard work, and it's very solitary work. So I vowed in the past never to write another book. And then Eve came along and she was so interesting. And she made me write the book. So yeah, who knows? I work a lot on out history, still trying to recover the lost LGBT history, and not enough historical work in particular, has been done on the subject. There's still Eve represents one of the amazing people that was never discovered before, and there are many others, so I urge people to become historians. Even you don't have to be. I did it because it was a labor of love. So I taught myself over the years how to do research and how to think about old documents and what the context that they come from and how does that bias what's being said. And very, you know, it got more and more interesting and more complicated as I went along. I guess that's my long answer to that question.
Well, in the meantime, all of our viewers, you can purchase Jonathan's book, The Daring Life and Dangerous Times of Eve Adams, from either the Chicago Review Press or bookshop.org, both of which are linked in the chat. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, thank you, Jonathan Ned Katz, so much for sharing your work and your insights with us today. Before we sign off, I want to invite everyone to join us on Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time for a tribute to our dedicated and resilient survivor community in honor of International Holocaust Survivor Day. And next week on Tuesday at 11 a.m., you can join us for another program presented in honor of Pride Month, Remembering the Pink Triangle. Jordana Gessler, our Vice President of Education and Exhibits, will speak with Joe Goldman of Hayes about Nazi persecution of the LGBTQ+ community, the complexity for liberation for gay men at the end of the Holocaust, and the ways in which we can continue to challenge the identity-based persecution that exists today. You can find more information about our virtual events on our website at holocaustmuseumla.org. Also, a recording of this program will be available on Holocaust Museum LA's YouTube channel. Holocaust Museum LA brings you programs like today's at no charge. If you are enjoying our programs, please consider supporting our work by becoming a member. To learn more about our membership levels and benefits, visit holocaustmuseumla.org/membership. Thank you again, Jonathan, for being with us here today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Take care, and we hope to see everyone in person at the museum sometime soon.